What I know from what I've been doing for a very long time is that for chronically homeless folks with multiple disabilities, housing is health care. And what I also know, and I think everyone in this room knows, is that the cure to homelessness is housing. It's that simple. Having said that, low demand, harm reduction, low threshold housing is messy and hard. We started doing it back in 1994 before any of these descriptors existed. And we started doing it on a very person-centered basis. We ran an overflow shelter in the winter for 10 chronically homeless men and women. And when we looked at what running that shelter would be like year-round, it looked like housing. So we opened our first permanent housing project in 1995. And from the day we started to operate housing, we have always been a very low demand, very low threshold provider of housing. The tenants in our housing are not required to be in treatment. They're not required to be on medication. They're not required to abstain. The only requirement for living in our housing is that they not present an imminent danger to self or others. It's messy. People are really messy, and it's really, really hard. You know, there's a feeling out there amongst traditional providers, you know, the abstinent-based recovery systems, the county systems, the hospital-based treatment centers, that harm reduction or low-demand housing is benign neglect, and that it's, you know, pretty easy. And it's the hardest work that I've ever done. It's sometimes very, very difficult to do nothing. We make incredible ethical decisions on a daily basis, and I think we all struggle with that. Most of our tenants have really, really great strengths, and one of their strengths is that they have really learned to push buttons. They've been pretty dramatically failed by most of the systems out there, and they're certainly going to test you. So it's a challenge. We deal with every day the pressure and the resistance from the more traditional providers, but I also think we question our own ability. We question what we're doing, why we're doing, how we're doing it, and we struggle with, or I know I struggle with, our own personal feelings about mental illness, about addiction, about the ways that people use, and about the ways that people choose to make decisions. And I think and I notice this most among young graduates of social work programs, the lack of an immediate reward. When you do this kind of housing, you are in it for the long haul. I'm retiring soon, and one of the things that I'm suddenly struggling with is that I have known some of my tenants and some of my guests for decades. They have become friends. I have crossed some professional boundaries. We all look for frameworks, and we all look for grids, and we all look for easy answers and solutions to tell us how to do stuff. It's really nice to have a checklist and say, if this is true, do this. If this isn't true, do this. That does not exist in this kind of housing. That does not exist when you're working with active workers. I still put up this hierarchy of ethical principles because I think it helps. It helps remind us of how and why we make decisions, because we're making really, really difficult decisions. And I'll tell you an ethical decision that I'm struggling with this week. We run a couple of site-based supported housing programs. I'm in a small upstate city in New York. It's a poor city. Our agency is small. Our housing projects are small. We don't have enough money or staff or clients and tenants to do any research or any studies, so we can only talk about personal experience. But the program that my office is located in is 22 folks living in 20 apartments. We have 18 studio apartments and 2 one-bedroom apartments for couples who have historically been split up by systems. And I'm sure that some of you have run into this. We don't have a whole lot of housing for couples where one or both of them are dealing with a serious persistent mental illness or an addiction. And we often split them up, which I think is one of the most inhumane things we can do. And so when we were developing this project, we knew two couples that could really deserved to be together. And they kept failing out of more traditional models of housing because they wanted to be together. So they would leave community residences, they would leave other supportive housing models, they would leave recovery housing because they wanted to live together. But whenever they lived together in a private apartment, there were pretty dramatic challenges. So anyway, we have these 22 folks, and out of these 22 folks, 9 are chronic alcoholics, and 4 are heroin users. Probably the rest of the people in the building are doing pretty well. They're in some kind of or some part of the journey toward recovery. Our 4 heroin users in the past couple of weeks have experienced some pretty serious problems. One got an abscess in his arm, the other one OD'd and almost died. About a month ago, we had a heroin user in our shelter OD and die. And the word on the street is that the heroin in Troy right now is purer than what is usually available to our folks, but is also laced and cut with something really bad and nasty, and it's making people sick. So our dilemma was that our tenants are tenants. They hold leases on their apartments. They have the same rights as anybody living in any apartment would. We take that very seriously. But we also have a pretty strong suspicion that someone is coming in and selling heroin in our building and distributing heroin in our building, one of the visitors. And our dilemma is kind of what to do about that. Do we prohibit visitors, which is probably illegal? Do we ignore it? Is that ethical? Do we, we know we have heroin users in the building. We're very honest and upfront with them. We have our own little needle exchange program going on in the building. It's not something that's unusual for us to talk about, but what was unusual for us to talk about is that the heroin in town right now is bad. And what do we do about the distribution of that heroin in our community? And I'm not going to tell you what we did. I just want you to think about it, because that's one of the decisions that we grapple with almost on a daily basis. We have advocates, and we call them advocates. We do not call them case managers. Case management has a medical connotation, and we are not medical providers. We're not clinical providers. We are housing providers, and all of the work that we do with our tenants is around success in permanent housing. And we deal with everything that way. And when you're talking about active users, that's how we deal with active use and abuse. If somebody blows their rent money on crack, we don't talk about how dangerous crack is. We talk about what happens when you don't pay the rent. And we talk about the risk of losing housing. We do everything we can to normalize these conversations and to build trust. Because if our tenants don't trust us and don't talk to us, we can never create a safe enough environment for them to choose to make change. And that is our goal. I do not want the 4 guys in our building to be heroin users for the rest of their lives. And I don't want the 9 alcoholics in our building to die of liver disease. I have not given up on any of them. Low demand, housing of last resort, whatever you want to call it, is not giving up on people. If we were giving up on them, we would have never created housing for them in the first place. But I'm painfully aware of how hard change is and how hard it is to make changes in your lives. And if we can create, and this is our goal, safe, respectful housing where people are treated with respect and dignity, people make great choices for themselves. And when they make their own choices and take ownership of those choices, their chances of making change are better. So our advocates do a lot. They're first and foremost, I think, they're team members. We work as a team. This is hard work to do by yourself. You can be full of doubt, you can get frustrated, you can get angry, you can get short-tempered. So we always work together as a team. Every advocate knows every tenant, and the advocates constantly talk to each other, share problem-solving ideas, different strategies and tactics. And they're partners and collaborators with their tenants, with the folks that they work with. They're counselors, they're supporters, they're cheerleaders. I often think that that's a lot of what we do, is just like really celebrate tiny, tiny little successful steps. Community organizers, planners, let's see what else they do. I skipped on that. I put up here the principles of housing first. It's very text dense. I'm not going to go through any of it in any great detail, but I think that there's a couple of things that are really important to remember, think about, and talk about when you're working with people who are active users. We live in a culture and a society that is full of active users. My building is not the only apartment building in South Troy that has people drinking and using drugs in it. We're not that different. It's pervasive in our community. It's part of our everyday life. And that doesn't mean that we approve of it or celebrate it or applaud it. We certainly work to minimize the harmful effects of some of the choices people make, but we do recognize that it's part of our life. We focus in our housing on quality of life and quality of community. We try to create a safe community where people are comfortable talking about the challenges they face and comfortable talking about their failures and their successes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about stopping using or stopping drinking. That's not always the criteria for success. One of our most successful tenants has been, she lived in the woods for 15 years in a park in the city of Troy. She lived in a tent. She's a very tough lady. Mean drunk. She held her own amongst some very tough guys. Every once in a while she would get the crap beat out of her, and she would show up at our shelter and come in, and she was always welcomed. We actually took her in whether we were full or not. If we had to put her on a couch, we put her on a couch. I think a few times she slept on the examining table in our nurse's office. We would do anything when she showed up to engage her, because she was one of those folks who didn't think she deserved shelter or housing, didn't think she was good enough to get help from us, couldn't get sober enough to come into our shelter, even though that wasn't an issue for us. After about 15 years, she got tired. And she had a great relationship with one of our staff people. You know, no matter how bad things were going for her, she always checked in with Shelley. And one day she stopped by and said to Shelley, "I'm really tired. Can I come in?" And she's been living in our housing now for almost 4 years. She is mostly sober. She relapses every August when the Saratoga track season begins. She loves the ponies. And every August and September, she blows her SSI check on gambling and drinking. She goes to the track and she just, in the first 3 days, spends it all on drinks and gambling. And this happens every year, and it's happened for the last 4 years. And then she spends the next 10 months paying us back for the rent she didn't pay, and it starts all over again. She's a success story. She's doing great. I kind of wish parts of my life were that ordered and comfortable and predictable. So, you know, we have to recognize that our tenants are in charge. We are not the agents of change. They are. All we are the information givers, the supporters, the providers. So what's most important to us is that we recognize that our tenants have a real voice. Sometimes that's really hard, particularly with chronic alcoholics, because sometimes their real voice is difficult to hear because they're so drunk all the time. And we have, I have an interesting old story from when we first started operating housing. We had a very, very difficult late-stage alcoholic in our housing, and he was mean, and he was cruel, and he was disruptive, and we just didn't know what to do, and we were embarrassed to admit that he might be our first failure, because we were really proud of this thing that we thought we invented, and we didn't know what to do with the guy, and we didn't want to evict him. He'd been in rehab 1,000,000 times. He'd never successful. He'd never even finished detox successfully. He just, like, you know, was a history of really colossal failures. And he was very resistant to any kind of treatment. And we never tell people that they should go to treatment. But with him, we came up with a strategy that we thought would let us get rid of him without us having to evict him. And we decided to tell him that we could not have a conversation with him about his behavior while he was drunk because he wasn't hearing us. So we said, listen, we really need to talk to you about how your behavior is threatening your housing, but we need to have that conversation when you're sober. So the only way that you can stay in our housing is if you go to detox for a couple of days. We're not telling you you have to stop drinking forever. We just want you to get sober enough to have this conversation with us about why you might get kicked out of housing. And we were really kind of sneakily proud of ourselves. We thought we got rid of Mike. Mike finished detox. Mike came back and had a very lucid and rational conversation with us. Mike loved his housing. Mike taught us a huge lesson about housing folks who actively use, and you brought it up, they value their housing. And housing is incredible leverage with this group of folks. Mike ended up living with us for the rest of his life. He went into a nursing home at the very end of his life and dying. And he put together pretty significant chunks of sobriety every once in a while. And even though I never once told him that I thought he should stop drinking or that I thought sobriety should be a goal for him, he would call me up whenever he tied a week or two together and say, hey, you know, I got 17 days. I just wanted you to know. So we didn't have to tell him what was important. He knew, and he knew that we thought it was important.